The air in the Sterling estate was thick with the scent of 5,000 imported lilies, and the suffocating perfume of the city's elite. Julian Sterling, a man whose face was more familiar to the Wall Street Journal than to his own neighbors, stood at the altar. He was a man of steel and logic, but today, he was a man in love, or so he thought. Beside him, Evelyn Thorne looked like a dream sculpted in white silk. To the world, she was the angel of mercy, a socialite known for her sprawling charity galas and her gentle touch. The cameras were rolling, live-streaming the wedding of the century to millions. Julian picked up the ring, a diamond so bright it seemed to hold the sun. Then, the heavy oak doors groaned open. A child ran down the aisle. She was small, perhaps 7 years old, wearing a blue floral dress that had been washed so many times the flowers were fading into ghosts. Her sneakers squeaked against the pristine marble. The guests gasped. The security team moved instinctively, but Julian raised a hand, stopping them. There was something about the girl's eyes. They weren't filled with the calculated malice of a business rival or the desperation of an ex-lover. They were wide, wet, and vibrating with a terrifying kind of honesty. "Stop, don't give her that ring," the girl screamed. Her voice cracked, a raw high-pitched sound that cut through the practiced elegance of the room. "She's a monster. She's the reason my daddy is dead." The silence that followed was more violent than the scream. An adult making this claim would have been tackled, sued, or ignored. An adult has motives: money, jealousy, revenge. But a child is a mirror. People looked at Lily and didn't see a threat, they saw the truth. Evelyn's face didn't just pale, it hardened. The angel vanished, replaced by a woman with a mouth like a thin, bitter line. "Julian, ignore this brat," she hissed. "It's a prank. Some disgruntled employee sent her." But Julian was looking at Lily. "Why did you say that, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice low. "She took our farm," Lily sobbed, her small chest heaving. "She told my daddy she would help him, but she lied. She made him sign papers he didn't understand. She took everything until we had to move into a tiny room. My daddy cried every night because he couldn't feed me. And then, he didn't wake up anymore." The innocent witness is a powerful narrative tool because it bypasses the brain and hits the heart. Lily didn't use big words like foreclosure, embezzlement, or predatory lending. She used the words of a child: cried, tiny room, didn't wake up. The guests, who had been ready to toast to Evelyn's health, now looked at her with growing horror. They saw the expensive lace of her sleeves and thought of the tiny room Lily described. Julian looked at the ring in his hand. It no longer looked like a symbol of love. It looked like the spoils of war. "I have proof," Lily whispered, reaching into her pocket. She didn't produce a flash drive or a complex legal brief. She held out a crumpled, tear-stained photograph of a man in overalls standing in front of a red tractor, smiling. On the back, in Evelyn's unmistakable, elegant handwriting, were the words, "Land acquired. Final payment sent to offshore account." Eliminate the Miller file. It was the final blow. The child hadn't just brought a story, she had brought the one thing Evelyn couldn't charm her way out of. The evidence of a life destroyed. Julian dropped the ring. The sound of it hitting the floor was the sound of a kingdom falling. He didn't look at the cameras or his guests. He walked toward the little girl in the faded dress, the only person in the room who had been brave enough to tell the truth. The wedding was over, but for the first time in years, Julian Sterling saw the world clearly. The Sterling estate was a monument to old money and carefully curated reputations. Every guest in attendance was a piece of a larger puzzle, but the centerpiece was Evelyn Thorne. As she stood under the floral arch, the soft afternoon light caught the delicate lace of her veil, making her appear almost translucent. She was the city's darling, the saint of the suburbs. A woman who spent her weekends at soup kitchens, and her evenings at fundraisers. Julian Sterling looked at her with a reverence that bordered on worship. To him, she wasn't just a wife, she was his moral compass. He picked up the heavy gold band, his voice thick with emotion as he began his final vow. "Evelyn, you have shown me that wealth is nothing without a heart that serves. She doesn't serve anyone but herself." The voice was a jagged blade that cut through Julian's sentiment. A young girl, disheveled and breathing hard, stood at the end of the aisle. She looked like a smudge of soot on a white canvas. Evelyn didn't turn around immediately. Her shoulders remained perfectly poised, her head tilted at that graceful angle the press loved. But Julian saw it, a tiny, frantic pulse hammering at the base of her throat. "Julian, darling," Evelyn whispered. Her voice was musical, a soothing hum designed to calm a nervous groom. "Don't let this unfortunate outburst distract you. Security will handle the poor thing. She's clearly confused." "I'm not confused," the girl, Lily, yelled, stepping onto the white runner. "You took my daddy's land, you told him you were helping the neighborhood, but you sold it to the developers and left us with nothing." Julian looked from the child to his bride. "Evelyn, do you know her?" "Of course not, Julian," Evelyn said. Her voice remained angelic, but the pitch had risen just a fraction. It was the sound of a violin string stretched too tight. "I've never seen her. She's likely been coached by one of your business rivals to cause a scene. It's a classic move, really. Let's just finish the ceremony and we can help her family privately afterward." "That would be the charitable thing to do, wouldn't it?" She reached for Julian's hand, her fingers cold and trembling. Julian hesitated. The saint was speaking, offering charity even in the face of a disruption. It was exactly why he loved her. But Lily wasn't finished. She held up a crumpled document. "My daddy kept the letters, the ones with the Thorne Foundation logo. You told him if he didn't sign, you'd have the city condemn the house anyway." Julian's eyes narrowed. He knew that logo. He had designed it for her. "Julian, this is enough," Evelyn's voice snapped. The music was gone. The soft, melodic hum had vanished, replaced by a sharp, metallic edge that made several guests flinch. "I will not have my day ruined by a peasant's lies. Security," I said. "Get her out of here now." She turned to face the girl, and for a split second, the villain's mask slipped completely. The warmth in her eyes was replaced by a cold, predatory hunger. Her face, usually so serene, twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You think a piece of paper changes who I am?" Evelyn hissed, her voice now a desperate, jagged rasp. Gone was the saint, standing there was the predatory real estate agent who had built a career on the bones of small families. "I am Evelyn Thorne, I am the face of this city's future. You are nothing but a footnote that should have been erased years ago." The silence that followed was absolute. The guests sat frozen, watching the saint crumble into a monster. Julian looked at the woman he thought he knew and realized he was looking at a stranger. "Evelyn," Julian said, his voice quiet and hollow. "The girl didn't ruin this day, you did." He dropped the ring. It didn't bounce, it simply thudded into the carpet, a heavy, dead weight. Evelyn reached for him, her voice cracking as she tried to pull the mask back on. "Julian, wait, I can explain, it was business, I did it for us." But the angelic voice was dead. All that was left was the desperate screech of a woman who had finally been seen in the light. Julian turned his back on the altar and walked toward the girl, leaving the bride standing alone in her white silk cage. The air in the garden of the Sterling estate was so still it felt fragile. Under a canopy of white wisteria, Julian Sterling held Evelyn's hand. He felt the slight tremor in her fingers, a detail he mistook for bridal nerves. In his other hand, the wedding ring sat like a heavy golden promise. The minister's voice was a soft drone, nearing the final, legal seal of their union. "Julian, do you take this woman?" This was the point of no return. In 5 seconds their lives would be legally, financially, and socially entwined. The guests held their breath, the photographers adjusted their lenses for the perfect shot of the ring sliding onto her finger. Julian began to move his hand, the gold band catching the light, ready to claim her. "Stop. If you put that ring on her finger, you're making the biggest mistake of your life." The scream didn't just break the silence. It shattered the reality of the afternoon. Julian's hand stopped mid-air. The ring was a fraction of an inch from Evelyn's knuckle. A young girl stood at the back of the aisle, gasping for air. Her hair was a wild mess of curls, and her dress, a cheap, faded thing, looked like a bruise against the perfection of the white-clad guests. "Julian, ignore her." Evelyn's voice came out in a sharp, jagged burst. The soft, melodic tone she had used for months was gone, replaced by a desperate urgency. "Security, take her away, she's trespassing." Julian didn't move. He looked at the ring, then at the girl. In his world of high-stakes acquisitions, he knew the feeling of a bad deal. This felt like a warning siren. "She's a liar," the girl, Lily, cried out, her voice echoing off the stone walls of the estate. "She's the reason my daddy is in a hospital bed. She took our home and called it charity." The hook was set. Every guest in the audience, every viewer watching the live stream was suddenly gripped by a single, burning question. How could this saint be a villain? The stakes had shifted from a romantic union to a public trial. Evelyn gripped Julian's arm, her nails digging into his suit jacket. "Julian, please, we are seconds away, just put the ring on, we can handle this afterward." But Julian saw the shift in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of a ruined ceremony. It was the terror of a hidden truth coming to light. The point of no return had passed. But not in the way Evelyn had planned. The moment the ring stopped moving, the power dynamic shifted. "She's the one who signed the papers," Lily screamed, holding up a crumpled, yellow document. "She told my daddy she would help him save the farm, but she was working for the people who tore it down." Julian looked at the girl, then back at the ring in his hand. The gold felt cold now. He thought of the millions he was about to merge with her foundation. He thought of the reputation he had spent a decade building. "Julian?" Evelyn's voice was a whisper now, a final, desperate plea. Julian looked her in the eye, and for the first time, he didn't see his bride. He saw a predator who had used his love as a shield. He didn't say a word. He simply opened his hand. The wedding ring fell. It didn't bounce. It hit the stone floor with a dull, final thud, and rolled toward the edge of the altar. The ceremony was over. The hook had pulled the truth into the light, and as Julian walked toward the girl in the faded dress, the world watched the saint of the city fall from grace in her own white garden. The atmosphere in the Sterling estate garden was suffocating. Until now, the dramatic scene had played out as a classic case of one word against another. On one side stood a frantic child in a faded dress, crying out accusations of ruin and heartbreak. On the other stood Evelyn Thorne, a woman of pristine reputation, weeping softly, behind her lace veil, wrapped in the protective outrage of the city's highest social circle. The guests were already leaning toward Evelyn. "It's a tragic situation, but she's clearly a confused child," Julian Sterling's cousin muttered from the front row. "Julian, put the ring on. Let's end this theater." Julian stood perfectly still, his hand hovering over Evelyn's. In the high-stakes world of corporate acquisitions, Julian knew that emotion was cheap. People lied, hearts panicked, and innocence could be simulated. He looked at Lily, then at Evelyn's tear-filled eyes. He was a logical man trapped in an emotional storm, frozen at the altar because he lacked a definitive reason to break a multi-million-dollar commitment. "She's just making up stories, Mr. Sterling." Lily's mother, Sarah, cried out from the edge of the lawn, her face pale with terror as she tried to pull her daughter back. "Please, don't listen to her." "I'm not making it up," Lily screamed. She broke away from her mother's grip. "I have the papers, Mommy, the ones you hid in the closet." Lily reached into her small, cheap purse and pulled out a folded, yellow document. It wasn't a photograph that could be dismissed as a simple misunderstanding, nor a diary entry that could be labeled as fiction. It was an official legal document. A foreclosure notice on a multi-generational family farm. The crowd grew silent as Lily walked the final few steps up the altar and handed the paper directly to Julian. Julian took it, his eyes instantly tracking the cold, hard numbers and dates. It was an official bank order, but stapled to the back of it was a piece of heavy, cream-colored stationery. Julian's chest went cold. He recognized that exact paper. He had purchased a custom batch of it for Evelyn just last Christmas. Written across the expensive paper in elegant, looping handwriting was a short, devastating note. "The farmer is refusing the buyout. File the fraud clause immediately and freeze his accounts. If he has no money to fight, he has no choice but to turn the land over to me. Make sure the Thorne Foundation name stays off the public registry." At the bottom of the note was a signature. "Evelyn Thorne," he said, she said. Dynamic vanished instantly. The story was no longer about a child's grief versus a bride's dignity. It was about indisputable, physical truth. The document provided the missing link, transforming an emotional accusation into an open and shut case of criminal extortion. Julian looked up from the paper, his eyes like flint. The warmth of a groom was entirely gone from his face. "You wrote this," he said, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. Evelyn looked at the paper in his hand, and the color drained from her face so fast it looked as though she had been struck. She reached for it, her fingers twitching. "Julian, that's an old business matter. It was completely legal, I swear. It's out of context." "Out of context?" Julian repeated, his voice echoing off the stone walls. You systematically ruined a family, took their livelihood, and used my foundation's resources to hide the paper trail. The physical evidence gave Julian the absolute justification he needed. He didn't just hesitate. He made a definitive, permanent choice. He dropped the 5-carat ring back into his breast pocket. The ceremony is over, Julian said, turning away from the woman he had almost called his wife. He looked down at Lily, the little girl who had carried the truth in a crumpled purse, and nodded. The paper in his hand had shattered a wedding, but it had saved his life. The grandeur of the Sterling estate had always been a fortress built to keep the small people out. The tall iron gates, the manicured hedges, and the security detail in earpieces were all designed to protect the world of the ultra-wealthy from the messiness of the reality outside. Julian Sterling was the king of this fortress. And Evelyn Thorne was about to be his queen. As the ceremony reached its peak, the social hierarchy of the room was clear. The front rows were filled with senators, tech moguls, and oil tycoons. The Goliaths of the modern world. Hidden in the shadows of the service corridor stood the Davids, the waiters, the cleaners, and the kitchen staff. Among them was Sarah, a woman who had spent 3 years scrubbing floors to keep a roof over her daughter Lily's head, ever since a development project had swallowed their family farm. When Lily broke rank and ran down that aisle, she wasn't just a child interrupting a wedding. She was a glitch in the system. She's a thief. Lily's voice rang out, small but piercing. The guests didn't look at Lily with sympathy. They looked at her with annoyance, as if a stray dog had wandered onto the set of a movie. Evelyn Thorne's reaction was the most telling. She didn't offer a motherly hand or a gentle word. She looked at Lily with the cold, distant gaze of someone looking at a broken piece of furniture. Julian, please, Evelyn whispered, her voice like silk over a blade. She is a nobody. Her mother is just a temporary hire in the kitchen. Let's not let the help dictate our wedding day. In that moment, the David versus Goliath dynamic was set. Evelyn represented the untouchable power of the elite. The belief that money and status could silence the truth. Lily and Sarah represented the invisible many. The people whose lives were often the collateral damage of the billionaire class's expansion. The audience watching. The guests in the garden and the millions on the live stream expected Julian to act like a typical Goliath. They expected him to signal security, remove the disturbing element, and proceed with the merger of two powerful dynasties. But Julian Sterling did something that shifted the world on its axis. He stepped down from the altar. He didn't just listen. He moved toward the girl. He walked away from the woman in the $10,000 dress and knelt in the dirt next to the girl in the faded floral print. By physically lowering himself, he leveled the playing field. Tell me everything, Julian said. Sarah, Lily's mother, stepped forward. She was shaking, her hands still smelling of the onions she had been chopping for the wedding feast. She looked at the senators and the tycoons, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a kitchen maid standing in the middle of a billionaire's dream, and she was about to wake him up. She handed Julian the letters, the physical proof of Evelyn's predatory tactics. As Julian read the words, the power dynamic flipped. The Goliath in white silk began to look small, while the David in the apron began to look towering. The emotional payoff came when Julian stood up. He didn't look at his social peers for approval. He looked at Evelyn and saw the rot beneath the polish. You called them the help, Evelyn, Julian said, his voice carrying to the very back of the garden. But they are the only ones in this room who have told me the truth today. He didn't just cancel the wedding. He offered his hand to Sarah and Lily, leading them away from the altar and toward the house. In that single act, the social justice of the story was realized. The Goliath had recognized the worth of the David, proving that even in a world built on gold and glass, the truth of a single honest voice can bring a fortress down. The viewers stayed until the very last frame, not for the drama, but for the rare, satisfying sight of power finally choosing the right side.